Did you know that for every single German soldier killed on the Western Front, the German army lost nearly 10 on the Eastern Front? The scale is almost impossible to grasp. We think we know the story. We think of endless snow, the T-34 tank, and massive armies clashing. But what if the real story is stranger, darker, and more complex than we ever imagined? What if the Soviet war effort was powered as much by terror and desperation as by patriotism? What if women, not men, were some of the war's most effective killers? And what if the whole colossal struggle nearly failed before it even began? Not because of the invaders, but because of the Soviet leader himself. The fight on the Eastern Front was the largest military confrontation in history. It consumed more people and material than all other theaters of the Second World War combined. But the details, the things that happened behind the official story, are where the real truth lies. Number 20. Did the Soviet Union truly win the peace? The victory parade in Moscow on June 24th, 1945 was an incredible spectacle. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, astride a white stallion, presided over a sea of victorious soldiers. They marched through Red Square, casting captured German military standards onto the stone in front of Lenin's mausoleum. It was a moment of absolute triumph. The 4-year struggle was over, the invader had been vanquished. But when the soldiers went home, what did they find? They found a country that was in many ways destroyed. The victory was real, but the peace was something else entirely. The cost was a number so large it becomes abstract. The official Soviet figure, established decades after the war, is around 27 million dead. Think about that. Not just soldiers, civilians, women, children. Historians, like Catherine Meredith, in her book Ivan's War, explore the personal toll. For every soldier killed in combat, it's estimated that at least one civilian died from starvation, disease, or direct violence. Entire regions were wastelands. The German army's scorched earth retreat had left nothing behind. In Belarus, over 200 cities and 9,000 villages were obliterated. In Ukraine, the industrial and agricultural heartland, the devastation was just as complete. The physical destruction was one thing. The human destruction was another. Millions were homeless, millions were orphans, millions were disabled physically and psychologically. The men who returned were not the same boys who had left. They had seen things that no human should see. They had participated in a war of annihilation where the lines between combatant and civilian had been erased. The state offered them medals and praise, but little else. The country was broke. There was a famine in 1946 to 47, partly caused by drought, but made far worse by the war's destruction and state policies. People who had survived the German invasion were now starving in peacetime. And what about the political victory? The Soviet Union had expanded its influence, creating a buffer of satellite states in Eastern Europe. It was a superpower. But this security came at the cost of liberty for millions of Poles, Czechs, Hungarians, and others. The peace was the beginning of the Cold War. The alliance that had defeated the German Reich fractured almost immediately. The world was now divided into two hostile camps, armed with nuclear weapons. The victory in 1945 did not lead to a generation of peace and prosperity for the Soviet people. It led to more sacrifice, more rebuilding, and a new kind of fear. The war's legacy became a cornerstone of the state's identity. It was a sacred story of heroism and sacrifice, but this official narrative, as detailed by scholars like Nina Tumarkina, papered over the immense unresolved trauma. The victory was a fact. The peace was a promise that was never truly kept. But how can we ever truly calculate the full economic cost of the war, including the lost potential of an entire generation? If the primary goal of a state is the well-being of its people, can a victory that costs 27 million lives and leaves the country in ruins truly be called a win? How did the psychological trauma of the war shape Soviet society for the next half-century, leading to its eventual collapse? And what if the price of defeating one totalitarian regime was the permanent entrenchment of another? Number 19, why was the war's deadliest sniper a woman? Her name was Lyudmila Pavlichenko. By the time the war ended, she was credited with 309 confirmed kills. This makes her the most successful female sniper in history and one of the deadliest snipers, period. Her story shatters the typical image of the war as an exclusively male enterprise. Pavlichenko was a history student at Kyiv University when the German forces invaded in June 1941. She immediately volunteered. The recruiting officer tried to push her towards being a nurse, but she had already earned a marksman certificate. She showed them her credentials, they gave her a rifle and an audition of sorts to shoot two collaborators who were working with the enemy. She passed the test. Her war began in the desperate fighting in southern Ukraine near Odessa and Sevastopol. Sniper work is not what you see in movies. It is slow, patient, and incredibly dangerous. It involves lying motionless for hours, sometimes days, in freezing or sweltering conditions. It's a psychological game. Pavlichenko described it as a duel. She was hunted by enemy snipers constantly. She once lay in a standoff with a German sniper for 3 days. In the end, she won. She wrote in her memoir, Lady Death, that the first time she killed, it was terrifying. But the sight of a dead comrade next to her changed everything. The hesitation vanished. She was not an outlier. The Soviet Union was the only major combatant nation in the Second World War to officially deploy women in frontline combat roles. Historian Svetlana Alekseyevich's book, The Unwomanly Face of War, is a stunning oral history built from the testimonies of hundreds of these women. They weren't just snipers, they were machine gunners, tank drivers, combat medics, and pilots. An estimated 800,000 women served in the Red Army during the war. The state's motivation was not progressive ideology, it was pure necessity. The catastrophic losses in the first year of the war meant they needed every body they could find. Propaganda posters depicted women as Mother Russia, calling on her sons to fight. But other posters showed women in uniform, holding rifles, urging their sisters to join the fight. For women like Pavlichenko, it was a chance to prove themselves equal. For the state, it was a practical solution to a manpower crisis. After being wounded by a mortar shell in 1942, Pavlichenko was pulled from combat. Her fame had grown, and she was now more valuable as a propagandist. She was sent on a tour of the United States, Canada, and Great Britain to rally support for a second front in Europe. She stood before crowds in America, a young woman in a uniform, and spoke plainly about the reality of the war. She famously chided the American press for asking her silly questions about her uniform and whether she wore makeup. She told them, I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascist invaders by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long? Her directness shocked them, but it worked. She became a symbol of Soviet resistance. But what happened to the hundreds of thousands of other women soldiers after the war? Why was their story largely written out of the official histories for decades? If women proved to be such effective combatants, why did their role become a footnote rather than a revolution in military thinking? We know Pavlichenko's confirmed kill count, but how many unconfirmed kills did she and other female snipers have? And how did the experience of frontline combat, of killing and watching people die, affect these women differently than their male counterparts in the deeply patriarchal society they returned to? Number 18, how did music and art become weapons of war? On August 9th, 1942, in the city of Leningrad, something extraordinary happened. The city had been under siege by German forces for nearly a year. Hundreds of thousands had already starved to death. The people were eating wallpaper paste, leather belts, and vermin. The city was being shelled daily, but on this day an orchestra gathered in the city's main concert hall. The musicians were emaciated. Some had to be brought to the rehearsal on sleds as they were too weak to walk. They were about to perform the world premiere of Dmitri Shostakovich's Symphony No. 7, the Leningrad Symphony. Shostakovich had started writing it in the besieged city. The score had been flown out on a microfilm canister. For the performance to be heard, the Soviet military command planned a special operation. They ordered their artillery to begin a massive bombardment of the German lines, not to prepare for an attack, but to ensure silence for the music. For the entire 80-minute performance, the guns of Leningrad were quiet. The symphony was broadcast over loudspeakers, not just to the citizens of the city, but across the front lines to the German soldiers. It was a powerful act of defiance. The music itself was a weapon. It was a statement that even in the face of starvation and death, the spirit of the city and the nation would not be broken. This wasn't an isolated event. The Soviet state understood the power of culture. Art wasn't a luxury, it was a central part of the war effort. Solomon Volkov's controversial book, Testimony, which purports to be Shostakovich's memoirs, highlights the composer's complex relationship with the state, but it leaves no doubt about the symphony's impact. The state mobilized its artists just as it mobilized its factory workers. The iconic The Motherland Calls poster, created by artist Irakli Toidze in 1941, became one of the most enduring images of the war. It showed a stark, powerful woman, her face a mixture of grief and fury, urging her sons to take up arms. It was everywhere. It wasn't just propaganda, it was a national icon. Songs were also crucial. The Sacred War became the unofficial anthem of the conflict. Its somber, powerful melody was first performed just days after the invasion began. It played on the radio constantly. It was about a righteous people's war, and it captured the mood of the country. Newsreels shown before movies in every cinema brought images of the front to the people. They were heavily censored and curated, of course. They showed Soviet heroism and enemy atrocities. They were designed to fuel hatred and resolve. The writers and journalists were also soldiers in this cultural war. Vasily Grossman, whose novel Life and Fate would later be banned for its honesty, was a war correspondent for the army newspaper Red Star. His dispatches from the front lines, especially from Stalingrad, were legendary. They brought the brutal reality of the fighting to millions of readers. This was a total war, and the front lines were everywhere, including in the concert halls, on the posters, and in the pages of newspapers. But how much of this art was genuine expression, and how much was simply state-coerced propaganda? Did Shostakovich intend his symphony as a tribute to the state's power, or as a lament for all victims of totalitarianism, including those who suffered under his own government? We know which posters and songs became famous, but how much art that expressed doubt, fear, or dissent was created and then immediately suppressed and destroyed? Could the Soviet Union have maintained popular morale and the will to fight without this massive coordinated cultural campaign? Number 17, who really designed the Katyusha rocket launcher. The German soldiers had a terrifying name for it: Stalin's organ. It was a sound they came to dread, a low moan followed by a deafening roar, and then a series of explosions that would saturate an entire area with shrapnel and fire. The weapon was the BM-13, better known as the Katyusha. It was a simple, brutal, and terrifyingly effective piece of military technology. It was essentially a rack of launch rails mounted on the back of a truck, capable of firing a volley of rockets in seconds. It wasn't very accurate, but it didn't need to be. Its purpose was area denial and psychological shock. The story of its creation is a perfect example of the secretive and often ruthless Soviet system. Unlike the T-34 tank, which had a clear design lineage, the Katyusha's origins are murky, tangled in the politics of the pre-war scientific community. The official credit is often given to a team led by Andrei Kostikov at the Jet Propulsion Research Institute. Kostikov received the highest honors for the weapon's development, but the real story is much darker, and researchers like Asif Siddiqui have pieced together a narrative of betrayal and intellectual theft. The foundational research on solid fuel rockets was done by brilliant engineers like Georgy Langemak and Ivan Klaymanov in the 1930s. They were pioneers, but during the Great Purge of the late 1930s, when Stalin's secret police saw spies and saboteurs everywhere, the institute was targeted. Kostikov, a lower-level engineer, allegedly wrote a denunciation of his superiors Langemak and Klaymanov. They were arrested, accused of treason, and executed in 1938. Kostikov then took over the project and presented their work as his own. He rose to the rank of general and became a hero of the Soviet Union. The true pioneers were erased from history, their names only rehabilitated decades later. The first experimental battery of 7 launchers was deployed in secret. It saw its first combat on July 14, 1941, near the city of Orsha. The target was a railway junction packed with German troops and supplies. The results were devastating. An entire grid square on the map was wiped out in a storm of fire. The German command was stunned. They had no idea what had hit them. The psychological impact was as important as the physical destruction. The weapon was kept under a fanatical level of secrecy. The crews were composed of hand-picked NKVD personnel, the secret police. They had orders to destroy their launchers if there was any danger of capture. The name Katyusha, a popular Russian diminutive for Catherine, is thought to have come from the K mark on the launcher's frame or from a popular wartime song of the same name. The soldiers gave it a human name, a small comfort for such an inhuman weapon. What other crucial Soviet weapon systems were developed by scientists who were later imprisoned or executed? How much did the political purges of the 1930s actually slow down rather than accelerate the development of key technologies like rocketry? Was Andrei Kostikov a brilliant opportunist, a patriot, or simply a villain who stole the work of dead men? And if the Katyusha had been ready in larger numbers at the start of the invasion, could it have blunted the initial German advance in a meaningful way? Number 16, what happened to Soviet soldiers who were captured? For a soldier, In the Red Army, surrender was not an option, it was an act of treason. Stalin's order number 270, issued in August 1941, was explicit. It stated that any commander or political officer who surrendered was to be considered a malicious deserter. Their families were to be arrested. Any soldier who chose captivity over fighting to the death was also a traitor. This official policy had devastating consequences for millions of men. In the first 6 months of the war, the German blitzkrieg was incredibly successful. They encircled vast Soviet armies. By the end of 1941, the Wehrmacht had captured over 3 million Soviet soldiers. It was a catastrophe of a scale never seen before. What happened to these men is one of the darkest chapters of the war. The German Reich had not signed on to parts of the Geneva Convention regarding the treatment of prisoners of war. But their treatment of Soviet POWs went far beyond legal neglect. It was a deliberate policy of extermination through starvation and exposure. As documented by historians like Christian Streit in his groundbreaking work, Keine Kameraden, No Comrades, the German military viewed these prisoners as subhuman. They were packed into open-air enclosures with no food, no water, and no shelter. They died in their hundreds of thousands from starvation, dysentery, and freezing to death during the winter of 1941 to 42. The numbers are staggering. Of the approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured during the war, it's estimated that over 3.3 million died in captivity. That is a death rate of almost 60%. It was a deliberate policy of mass murder, but the tragedy did not end there. For the Soviet soldiers who managed to survive the horrific conditions of the German camps, liberation in 1945 was not a moment of joy. It was a moment of fear. They were not welcomed home as heroes. They were viewed with suspicion. Why had they survived? Had they collaborated with the enemy? Stalin and the security apparatus, the Nkvd, saw every returned POW as a potential traitor or spy. Upon their return to Soviet-controlled territory, they were not sent home. They were sent to filtration camps. Here, they were interrogated for weeks or months. They had to prove their loyalty. They had to explain how they were captured and how they survived. Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago describes this process in chilling detail. Many were cleared and returned to the army, often to serve in penal battalions. But hundreds of thousands were deemed politically unreliable. They were sentenced without trial to years of forced labor in the Gulag. They had survived the German camps only to be imprisoned by their own country. They had fought for their homeland, suffered unspeakably at the hands of the enemy, and were then branded as traitors by the very government they had fought to defend. How many Soviet POWs were executed by their own side immediately after liberation, before they even reached a filtration camp? What percentage of those who survived German captivity ended up dying in the Gulag? Did Allied leaders like Roosevelt and Churchill know the extent of both the German mistreatment of Soviet POWs and the Soviet state's policy towards its own returning soldiers? And what happened to the families of POWs who, according to Order 270, were supposed to be arrested and punished? Did that order ever get fully carried out on a mass scale? At number 15, how important was the horse to a mechanized army? When we picture the Eastern Front, we think of tanks. The T-34, the Tiger, the Panther. We imagine a war of engines, steel, and gasoline. And that's part of the story. But it's not the whole story. The forgotten hero and victim of the Eastern Front was the horse. Both the German Wehrmacht and the Soviet Red Army were far less mechanized than we assumed. They were, in fact, powered by horseflesh to a staggering degree. The Red Army began the war with a massive cavalry force, which was largely destroyed in the opening months of the invasion. But the horse was not obsolete. As the war progressed, the Soviets realized the unique value of cavalry in the vast, roadless expanses of the East. And cavalry units could move through forests and swamps where tanks and trucks would get bogged down. They were ideal for deep raids behind enemy lines, disrupting supply and communication. By 1943, the Red Army had re-established dozens of cavalry divisions, but the horse's most important role was not in combat. It was in logistics. The engine that supplied the front lines was often a team of exhausted horses pulling a cart. They hauled food, ammunition, and artillery pieces through mud and snow that would have stopped any truck. Historian John Keegan points out that while German infantry divisions were meant to be motorized, most of them relied on thousands of horses to pull their supplies and artillery. The same was true for the Soviets. Millions of horses served in the Red Army, and millions of them died. They were shelled, bombed, and machine gunned. They starved to death when fodder ran out. They froze to death in the brutal winters. Their contribution is almost entirely overlooked. A T-34 tank is a powerful symbol. A starving horse pulling a wagon through the mud is not. But without that horse, the ammunition never reaches the front, the food never reaches the soldiers, and the artillery piece never gets into position. The entire war machine grinds to a halt. The reliance on horses also reveals a key weakness of the Soviet economy. They could produce vast numbers of simple, rugged tanks and guns, but they could not produce the vast number of trucks and support vehicles needed to maintain a truly modern mechanized army. That's one of the reasons American Lend-Lease aid was so crucial. The hundreds of thousands of Studebaker and Dodge trucks provided by the United States gave the Red Army a mobility it had never possessed. This allowed them to execute the massive deep battle operations of 1944 and 1945 that ultimately crushed the Wehrmacht. But even with this aid, the humble horse remained a vital component of the Soviet war machine until the very end. We know roughly how many tanks and planes were produced, but do we have any accurate count of how many million horses were consumed by the war on the Eastern Front? How did the mass requisitioning of horses from collective farms impact the food supply for the civilian population? Were there specific military operations that succeeded or failed specifically because of the availability or lack of horses? And how did veterinary medicine adapt to treat millions of wounded animals on an industrial scale in the middle of a war? Number 14, why were entire ethnic groups branded as traitors? The Soviet Union presented itself as a brotherhood of nations, a place where dozens of ethnic groups lived in socialist harmony. The war shattered this illusion. While the state called for unity against the invader, it was also carrying out a series of brutal mass deportations of its own citizens. These were not arrests of individuals. These were the forced relocations of entire ethnic populations. The logic was one of collective punishment and paranoid suspicion. Stalin and the head of his secret police, Lavrenti Beria, believed that certain ethnic groups were inherently disloyal. They feared these groups would collaborate with the advancing German army, so they decided to remove them. The first victims were the Volga Germans, descendants of German settlers invited to Russia by Catherine the Great centuries earlier. In August 1941, the entire population of the Volga German Autonomous Republic, over 400,000 people, was rounded up. They were given a few hours to gather their belongings, packed into cattle cars, and shipped thousands of miles east to Siberia and Central Asia. Their republic was abolished. They were branded as spies and saboteurs, even though many of their sons were fighting and dying in the Red Army at that very moment. But this was just the beginning. As the Red Army began to push the German forces back, the deportations accelerated. Between 1943 and 1944, a series of even more brutal operations were carried out in the North Caucasus region. In a matter of days, the entire Chechen and Ingush populations, nearly 500,000 people, were arrested by NKVD troops. This operation, codenamed Lentil, was a masterpiece of state terror. The people were told they were attending meetings, then surrounded and forced onto trucks and trains. The same fate befell the Karachays, the Balkars, and the Kalmyks. A little later, it was the Crimean Tatars. All were accused of mass collaboration with the German occupation forces. While it is true that some individuals in these groups did collaborate, just as some individuals in every Soviet ethnic group, including Russians, did, the evidence for mass collaboration was flimsy to non-existent. Historians like Norman Naimark, in his book Fires of Hatred, argue that these were acts of ethnic cleansing, driven by long-standing prejudice and Stalin's desire to secure sensitive border regions by populating them with more reliable ethnic Russians. The journey east was horrific. Thousands died in the unheated, overcrowded cattle cars from disease, starvation, and cold. Once they arrived at their destinations, they were dumped in remote areas with no housing and little food, forced to fend for themselves under the watchful eye of the NKVD. It's estimated that in some groups, like the Crimean Tatars, nearly half the population died during the deportation or in the first few years of exile. It was a war within a war. While the Soviet Union was fighting for its survival against an external aggressor, it was also waging a brutal campaign against its own citizens. How many NKVD troops were diverted from the war effort to carry out these massive internal deportations? Was there any serious debate at the highest levels of the Soviet government about the morality or strategic wisdom of these actions, or was it a closed decision by a tiny circle of leaders? We know the official justifications were false, But did local officials on the ground invent or exaggerate evidence of collaboration to please their superiors in Moscow? And how many soldiers in the Red Army discovered that, while they were fighting at the front, their entire family and village had been arrested and deported as enemies of the state? Number 13. How did the Red Army use deception to win its biggest battles? The Western image of the Red Army is often one of brute force, a steamroller that crushed its opponents through sheer numbers. This is a dangerous oversimplification. The Red Army, especially in the later stages of the war, became masters of a military art the Russians call maskirovka. It means camouflage, concealment, and deception. But it's more than that. It's a whole philosophy of war. It's about deceiving the enemy at every level, from the tactical to the strategic. It's about making the enemy see what you want him to see and believe what you want him to believe. One of the greatest examples was Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944. This was the massive Soviet offensive in Belarus that shattered the German Army Group Center. The German High Command knew an offensive was coming. They expected it to be in the south, aimed at Romania and the oil fields. The Soviets did everything possible to encourage this belief. They concentrated their radio traffic in the south. They ran reconnaissance flights in the south. They built dummy airfields and concentration areas for tanks in the south. They even allowed German reconnaissance planes to overfly these fake buildups. Meanwhile, in the forests and swamps of Belarus, the real buildup was happening under conditions of extreme secrecy. An enormous force of over 2 million men, thousands of tanks, and artillery pieces was assembled. Troop movements were done only at night. Strict radio silence was observed. The result was that when the offensive began on June 22nd, 1944, the third anniversary of the initial invasion, the Germans were taken by complete and total surprise. The Army Group Center, one of their most powerful formations, simply disintegrated in a matter of weeks. It was a strategic deception on a scale that is hard to comprehend. The work of military historian David Glantz, who has spent his career studying the Eastern Front from Soviet archives, has been crucial in revealing the sophistication of these operations. He shows that this wasn't a one-off trick. The Soviets used maskirovka to win at Stalingrad, where they secretly built up the armies for the massive pincer movement that trapped the German Sixth Army. They used it at Kursk, where they created a vast defense in depth, luring the German panzer divisions into a killing ground, all while hiding the huge reserve armies they planned to use for their counter-offensive. Maskirovka wasn't just about fake tanks. It was a whole ecosystem of deception. It involved spreading disinformation through double agents, creating phantom armies, and conducting diversionary attacks. It required immense discipline and coordination, and it exploited a key weakness of the German military leadership, their arrogance and their tendency to underestimate their opponent. They continued to believe the Red Army was an unsophisticated horde, even as that horde was preparing to pull off some of the most complex and successful deception operations in the history of warfare. How did the Soviets manage to maintain such incredible operational security among millions of soldiers, many of whom were poorly educated peasants? Were there any major deception plans that failed spectacularly, and if so, what went wrong? Who were the anonymous colonels and generals, the unsung geniuses who actually planned and orchestrated these massive deceptions? And to what extent was the success of Maskirovka dependent on intelligence provided by, Allied code breaking or spies within the German system? Number 12. Did the Gulag help win the war? People talk about the factories and the soldiers, but there was another engine powering the Soviet war machine. It was dark, it was brutal, and it was run on slave labor. We're talking about the Gulag. Before the war, the Gulag, run by the NKVD, was already a massive system of prison camps. But when the German forces pushed east, the Gulag became a critical part of the war economy. This is the uncomfortable truth. A significant portion of the resources that fueled the Red Army came from the forced labor of millions of its own citizens who had been declared enemies of the state. The contribution was immense. Prisoners in the infamous Kolyma camps in the Far East mined for gold. This gold was used to purchase vital war materials from abroad before Lend-Lease really got going. Prisoners cut timber for fortifications, mined nickel and cobalt for armor plating, and built railways to new industrial centers in Siberia. The numbers, detailed in books like Anne Applebaum's Gulag: A History, are stark. During the war, the Gulag was one of the country's top producers of many key raw materials. But It wasn't just raw materials, the Gulag system also included a network of special prisons for scientists and engineers known as sharashkas. Here, brilliant minds who had been arrested during the purges were forced to work on military projects. Andrei Tupolev, one of the Soviet Union's most famous aircraft designers, spent part of the war designing bombers while a prisoner in a sharashka. So did Sergei Korolev, the man who would later become the father of the Soviet space program. They were given better food and conditions than the common prisoners, but they were still slaves, working for the very state that had imprisoned them. The human cost of this contribution was catastrophic. The prisoners were seen as an expendable resource. Rations were cut to near starvation levels. The work was brutal, and the hours were long. The death rates in many camps skyrocketed. People froze to death, starved to death, or were simply worked to death. There was no pretense of rehabilitation. The Gulag was an economic empire built on the systematic destruction of human beings. So, did it help win the war? The answer in a purely material sense is yes. The labor of millions of prisoners provided resources and technical expertise that the Soviet Union desperately needed. It is a deeply disturbing part of the story. The victory over one brutal, inhuman system was achieved, in part, by harnessing the power of another. Could the Soviet war economy have functioned without this slave labor, or would it have collapsed under the strain? How many crucial wartime inventions were actually developed inside a prison camp by brilliant minds who were declared enemies of the state? If a nation uses its own imprisoned citizens as a disposable resource to fight an external enemy, what does that say about the nature of its victory? We know about the production numbers, but do we have any real idea of the exact number of prisoners who died producing a specific tank or a specific kilogram of gold for the war effort? The number 11 was the T-34, really the best tank of the war. The T-34 is a legend. It's often called the tank that won the war. When it first appeared on the battlefield in 1941, it was a shock to the German army. Their standard anti-tank guns simply bounced off its sloped frontal armor. Its wide tracks allowed it to move through the mud and snow of the Russian landscape better than the German panzers. And its 76mm gun was more powerful than anything the Germans had on their tanks at the time. It was a revolutionary design. The combination of sloped armor, a powerful gun, and good mobility was a game changer. So, was it the best? The answer is complicated. It depends on how you define best. In a one-on-one fight with a later German tank like a Tiger or a Panther, the T-34 was often outmatched. The German tanks had much better optics, meaning their gunners could see farther and more clearly. Their guns were more accurate and had a longer range. Their crew comfort was vastly superior, which reduced fatigue and improved combat effectiveness. The T-34, by contrast, was crude. It was incredibly loud inside, the transmission was notoriously difficult to shift. The initial two-man turret design was a major flaw. The tank commander also had to act as the gunner, which made it impossible to do both jobs effectively. The quality of the construction, especially during the desperate days of 1942, was often terrible. The armor plating could be brittle and the welds were poor. But the genius of the T-34 wasn't in its technical perfection, it was in its design philosophy. As Richard Overy explains in his book, Russia's War, the Soviets didn't try to build the best possible tank. They tried to build a good enough tank that could be produced in astronomical numbers. The T-34 was simple. It was easy to manufacture, even with an unskilled workforce. It was relatively easy to repair in the field. And they built them in staggering quantities. The Soviet Union produced over 80,000 T-34s in vehicles based on its chassis during the war. The Germans built fewer than 2,000 Tigers. The Red Army could afford to lose tanks at a horrific rate because there were always more coming from the factories behind the Ural Mountains. The German tank crews might have been better trained and had better equipment, but they were eventually overwhelmed by the sheer relentless numbers of T-34s. The best tank wasn't the one with the best gun or the thickest armor. It was the one that was there, on the battlefield, in the right place, in sufficient quantity. By that measure, the T-34, for all its flaws, has a very strong claim to the title. What was the real average lifespan of a T-34 tank and its crew on the Eastern Front? How many T-34s were lost, not to enemy fire, but to mechanical breakdown? If the Soviets had focused on quality over quantity, producing fewer but more advanced tanks, would they have been more or less successful? And did the designers ever consider a radical redesign to fix known flaws like the two-man turret, or was the pressure for sheer numbers too great to allow for any pause in production? Number 10. How did the Soviets feed an army of 11 million? By 1943, the Red Army had over 11 million men and women under arms. It was the largest army in history, or an army, as the saying goes, marches on its stomach. So how did a country that had lost its most fertile agricultural land, the bread basket of Ukraine, manage to feed this enormous force? The answer is barely, and with incredible brutality. The story of Soviet logistics is not one of efficiency. It's one of desperation, improvisation, and a ruthless prioritization of the army over the civilian population. When the German army invaded, they quickly overran the regions that produced most of the Soviet Union's food. This created an immediate crisis. The state's response was twofold. First, they relied on what they had. The collective farm system, which had been so disastrous in peacetime, proved grimly effective in wartime. It was designed for centralized control. The state could simply seize whatever food was produced, leaving the farmers with almost nothing. This led to widespread hunger and starvation in the countryside, but it ensured that the army got its rations. The soldiers' diet was monotonous and meager. The basic ration was black bread, some form of grain porridge called kasha, and soup, often made with salted fish or low-quality meat. But even this was not always available. In his book, Absolute War, Chris Bellamy notes that during major offensives, supply lines would break down, and soldiers would have to live off the land, which was a euphemism for looting from the local population, both in their own country and later in enemy territory. The second part of the solution was Lend-Lease aid from the United States. While we often think of Lend-Lease in terms of tanks and planes, its most important contribution might have been food. The Americans sent millions of tons of flour, sugar, and most famously canned meat. The Soviet soldiers called the American canned meat the second front. It became a vital part of their diet. It was higher in protein and calories than almost anything else they had access to. This flood of American food freed up the Soviet agricultural system to focus on producing the absolute basics like bread. The logistics of getting the food to the front were a nightmare. It had to be transported thousands of miles on an overburdened and constantly repaired railway system. From the railheads, it was moved by trucks, carts, and sometimes even on the backs of soldiers. There was no room for sentiment. The state's policy was clear: feed the soldier first, the factory worker second, and everyone else last. The result was a system that managed, just barely, to keep its massive army functioning, while millions of its civilians, especially in the occupied territories and the countryside, starved to death. How many Soviet civilians died of starvation during the war, not in the besieged cities, but in the rural areas that were stripped bare to feed the army? What would happen to the Red Army's fighting capacity in 1943 and 1944 without American food aid? Were there organized mutinies or large-scale desertions caused by a lack of food at the front? And did the state ever calculate the long-term damage to its own agriculture by prioritizing short-term military needs so completely? Number 9. Why did an atheist state suddenly embrace the church? For 2 decades before the war, the Soviet state had waged a relentless war on religion. The official ideology was militant atheism. Churches were closed, turned into warehouses or museums of atheism. Priests, imams, and rabbis were arrested, sent to the Gulag, or shot. The Russian Orthodox Church was persecuted almost to the point of extinction. By 1939, only a few hundred parishes were still functioning in the entire country. Then, in 1941, the German army invaded, and something strange happened. The state's attitude towards the church began to change. The anti-religious propaganda softened. Some churches were allowed to reopen. It was a stunning reversal. The pivot point came in September 1943. In a move that shocked everyone, Joseph Stalin invited the 3 leading metropolitans of the Russian Orthodox Church to a meeting at the Kremlin. He had not met with church leaders for over 20 years. He told them he recognized their patriotic service to the country. He gave them permission to elect a new patriarch, the head of the church, a position that had been vacant since 1925. Why did this happen? It was not a spiritual conversion on Stalin's part. It was a calculated, pragmatic, political move. Stalin was a former seminary student. He understood the deep hold that religion still had on many of the Russian people, especially the older generation and those in the countryside. In the darkest days of the war, he needed every possible source of morale and national unity. Patriotism was not enough. He needed to tap into the powerful historical narrative of Holy Mother Russia defending itself against foreign invaders. The church, with its long history of standing with the state in times of national crisis, was the perfect vehicle for this. As historian Dmitry Pospilovsky has documented, the church seized the opportunity. From the moment the invasion began, church leaders had called on the faithful to defend the motherland. They raised money to buy tanks and planes for the Red Army. The famous Mitri Donskoy tank column was funded entirely by church collections. This new alliance between the officially atheist state and the long persecuted church was a paradox. But it served both their interests. For Stalin, it helped mobilize the population, legitimized his rule in a new way, and was a useful tool for foreign policy, especially in impressing his Western allies and appealing to Orthodox Christians in the Balkans. For the church, it was a matter of survival. It allowed them to come out of the shadows, to rebuild some of their shattered institutions, and to regain a place in society. It was a deal with the devil, but it was the only deal on offer. Did Stalin ever consider a full-scale religious revival, or was this always intended as a temporary wartime measure? How did the rank-and-file members of the Communist Party, who had been taught for decades to hate religion, react to this sudden change in policy? What happened to the priests who refused to cooperate with the state, viewing it as a corrupt bargain? And did this wartime revival have a lasting impact on religious belief in the Soviet Union, or did the persecution simply resume in a different form after the victory was won? Number 8, could a soldier be a prisoner in his own army? The Red Army had a unique and brutal way of dealing with discipline and perceived cowardice. It was a system that made soldiers prisoners within their own military. We're talking about the penal battalions, or Strafbats. These were units composed of soldiers and officers who had been convicted of a military crime. This could be anything from desertion or cowardice to falling asleep on guard duty or making a negative comment about the government. Instead of being sent to a military prison, they were sent to a penal battalion. It was often a death sentence. The theory was that they could atone for their crimes with blood. Penal units were sent to the most dangerous parts of the front. They were used for suicidal missions like charging heavily fortified German positions or clearing minefields by walking through them. They were the first to attack and the last to be withdrawn. They were human minesweepers. Behind them were often NKVD blocking detachments, special troops with orders to shoot anyone who tried to retreat. This whole system was formalized by Stalin's famous Order Number 227, issued in July 1942, during the desperate battle for Stalingrad. The order is famous for its slogan, "Not one step back." It decreed that anyone who retreated without orders was to be shot on the spot. It authorized the creation of both the penal battalions for disgraced soldiers and the blocking detachments to enforce discipline on the regular troops. It was a policy born of pure desperation. The Red Army was on the verge of collapse. Stalin believed that only through absolute terror and coercion could he stop the retreat. Historians like Antony Beevor, in his book Stalingrad, described the grim reality of this order. It created a situation where a soldier's chances of survival were often just as low if he advanced as if he retreated. Who served in these units? It was a mix. There were genuine cowards and deserters. There were also officers who had failed in their commands. But many were just unlucky soldiers who had committed minor infractions, and a significant number were former prisoners of war who had escaped or been liberated. As we've seen, they were considered inherently suspect, and many were sent to penal battalions to prove their loyalty. Service in a penal battalion was, for a fixed term, usually 1 to 3 months. If a soldier was wounded, his sentence was considered complete, and he could be returned to a regular unit. If he survived his term, his rank was restored, but the survival rates were abysmal. For many, it was a short, brutal, and anonymous path to the grave. What was the actual casualty rate in penal battalions compared to regular rifle units? Did the use of these units actually improve the overall discipline and fighting effectiveness of the Red Army, or did it just lead to wasted lives? We hear about the blocking detachments, but how often did they actually open fire on their own retreating troops? And what was the psychological effect on a soldier who survived a penal battalion and was returned to a regular unit? Was he seen as a hero, or was he forever tainted by the stigma? Number 7, were partisans noble freedom fighters or ruthless warlords? The story of the Soviet partisans is one of the most mythologized parts of the war. The official narrative is of a heroic, popular uprising. Ordinary men, women, and even children taken to the forests to fight the invader. They blew up trains, ambushed German convoys, and provided vital intelligence for the Red Army. They were a second front behind the German lines, And all of this is true. The partisan movement, especially in Belarus and parts of Ukraine and Western Russia, was a major factor in the war. At its peak, it involved hundreds of thousands of fighters. They tied down huge numbers of German security troops who could have been used at the front. The book, The Soviet Partisan Movement 1941 to 1944 by Leonid Grankovich, provides a detailed military analysis of their operations. They were a constant bleeding sore for the German army. But there is a much darker side to the story. The partisan movement was not a spontaneous popular uprising. From the very beginning, it was controlled and directed from Moscow. Experienced Red Army officers and NKVD agents were dropped behind enemy lines to organize and lead the partisan groups. The movement was a tool of the state, and it was often ruthless. The partisans needed food, weapons, and supplies. They often took them from the local population by force. For a peasant living under German occupation, the arrival of a partisan group could be just as dangerous as the arrival of a German patrol. If they gave food to the partisans, the Germans would execute them for it. If they refused to give food to the partisans might execute them as collaborators. They were caught in an impossible position. This is a theme explored in depth by historian Kenneth Slepian. He shows that the relationship between the partisans and the civilian population was often one of coercion and fear, not a simple bond of patriotic unity. Furthermore, not all partisan groups were the same. Some were disciplined military units. Others were little more than bands of warlords who fought the Germans, but also fought rival partisan groups and terrorized the local population. There were also anti-Soviet partisans, nationalists from Ukraine or the Baltic states who fought against both the Germans and the Soviets. The reality in the occupied territories was a brutal, multi-sided civil war, not a simple story of good versus evil. The German response to partisan activity was one of savage collective punishment. For every German soldier killed, they would execute dozens, sometimes hundreds, of civilians from the nearest village. This created a horrific dynamic. The more successful the partisans were, the more the civilian population suffered in reprisals. How many Soviet civilians were killed by partisans for suspected collaboration, and how many were killed by the Germans in reprisals for partisan attacks? To what extent did partisan activities actually help the Red Army's strategic goals versus simply creating chaos and suffering behind the lines? What happened to the partisan leaders after the war? Were they celebrated as heroes, or were they seen as a threat by a state that demanded total control? And how much of the partisan activity was actually just banditry, with a thin veneer of political justification? Number 6. Who were the night witches? They flew in planes made of canvas and plywood. They were so slow that their maximum speed was less than the stall speed of the standard German fighter planes. They had no parachutes, no guns for defense, and no radios. They flew only at night. The Germans on the ground could hear their engines cut out as they neared their targets, making a soft whoosh, sound that reminded them of a witch's broomstick. So they gave them a nickname, the Nachtwechseln, or the Night Witches. They were the women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment of the Soviet Air Force. They were from pilots to navigators to ground crew, all women. This was unique. No other country in the war had an all-female combat aviation regiment. Their commander was a woman named Yevdokia Bershanskaya. The regiment was the brainchild of Marina Raskova, a famous Soviet aviator who convinced Stalin to authorize the formation of 3 female air combat units. The 588th was equipped with the Polikarpov Po-2, a biplane that was designed in the 1920s as a crop duster and training plane. It was completely obsolete, but it had advantages. It was maneuverable, and its low speed made it hard for the faster German fighters to shoot down. The women turned its weaknesses into strengths. They developed a terrifying tactic. They would fly in groups. 1 or 2 planes would approach the target and draw the attention of the searchlights and anti-aircraft guns. The other planes would cut their engines and glide silently through the darkness to drop their bombs with deadly precision. Then they would restart their engines and disappear back into the night. Each crew flew multiple missions per night, sometimes as many as 10 or 15. The work was exhausting and incredibly dangerous. The planes were flimsy and offered no protection. If they were hit by tracer fire, the canvas would ignite like paper. Their bomb load was small, just a few bombs carried under the wings. But what they lacked in firepower, they made up for in persistence and accuracy. Over the course of the war, the regiment flew more than 24,000 combat sorties. They dropped thousands of tons of bombs on German supply depots, command posts, and rear area installations. They were a constant source of harassment. The German command eventually offered the Iron Cross to any pilot who could shoot one down. The women of the 588th, like their sniper and infantry counterparts, were not fighting for feminist ideals. They were fighting for their country. Many of them were young, some still in their teens. They endured the same hardships as the male soldiers, plus the added burden of sexism and skepticism from some of their male comrades. But they proved themselves over and over again. By the end of the war, the 588th was one of the most highly decorated units in the Soviet Air Force. Why did the Soviet military, after creating these pioneering all-female combat units, disband them immediately after the war and discourage the women from continuing their flying careers? How many of the night witches suffered from long-term psychological trauma, and was there any system in place to help them? We know their combat record, but what was the social dynamic like within an all-female military unit living and fighting in such extreme conditions? And were there other less famous examples of all-female units in other branches of the Soviet military that have been forgotten by history? Number 5, did Stalin's purges cripple his own army? In 1937 and 1938, just a few years before the most destructive war in its history, the Soviet Union systematically destroyed the leadership of its own army. This was the Great Purge. Under Stalin's orders, the NKVD arrested, tortured, and executed a huge percentage of the Red Army's officer corps. The numbers are hard to believe. 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union were executed. 13 of the 15 army commanders were executed. Over half of all divisional and corps commanders were arrested. In total, tens of thousands of officers were swept up in the purge. The official reason was that they were part of a vast conspiracy with foreign powers to overthrow the government. The real reason was Stalin's paranoia and his desire to eliminate anyone who might pose a potential threat to his absolute power. The man who led this purge of the army was Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, a brilliant and forward-thinking military strategist. He was a proponent of the deep battle theory, a sophisticated doctrine of combined arms warfare that was years ahead of its time. Tukhachevsky and his colleagues were accused of being German spies, tortured into confessing, and shot. The very men who best understood modern warfare were eliminated. They were replaced by political loyalists, men chosen for their obedience to Stalin rather than their military competence. The most prominent of these was Clement Voroshilov, an old crony of Stalin's from the Civil War days. He was a cavalryman who had little understanding of tanks or airplanes. The effect on the Red Army was catastrophic. It was decapitated. The new commanders were often inexperienced and terrified of taking any initiative, lest they be accused of sabotage. The army's training and readiness plummeted. When the Red Army invaded Finland in the Winter War of 1939-40, this weakness was brutally exposed. The tiny Finnish army inflicted humiliating defeats on the vastly larger Soviet force. The Red Army was shown to be a poorly led, poorly organized mess. The German leadership watched the Winter War with great interest. It confirmed their belief that the Red Army was a hollow giant that would collapse after a single hard blow. This was a major factor in their decision to invade in 1941. So when the invasion came, the Red Army was led by men who were unprepared. They were unable to cope with the speed and ferocity of the German blitzkrieg. The initial disasters of 1941, the massive encirclements, and the loss of millions of soldiers can be traced directly back to the destruction of the officer corps in 1937-38. The Soviet Union would eventually recover. A new generation of talented commanders like Georgy Zhukov and Konstantin Rokossovsky would rise through the ranks. But they rose to prominence over the bodies of millions of dead soldiers who paid the price for Stalin's paranoia. If the purges had not happened, could a Red Army led by Tukhachevsky and his colleagues have stopped the German invasion in 1941? How many of the officers who were executed were actually innocent, and is it possible that a small number were genuinely disloyal? Did Stalin ever privately admit that the purges were a mistake? Or did he continue to believe they were necessary until the day he died? And what was the long-term effect on the Soviet military psyche of knowing that your greatest danger might not be the enemy in front of you, but the secret police behind you? Number 4, was the Red Army just a human wave? The enduring image of the Red Army in the West is the human wave attack. A commissar blows a whistle and thousands of poorly armed soldiers charge blindly into German machine gun fire with more men behind them to pick up the rifles of the fallen. This image comes from German propaganda and Cold War era movies. It's a caricature, but like many caricatures, it contains a grain of truth that obscures a more complex reality. In the desperate days of 1941 and 1942, there were indeed instances of poorly planned, costly frontal assaults. The Red Army had lost most of its experienced officers and was filled with raw conscripts. Often, a direct attack was the only thing the commanders knew how to do. And the Soviet states certainly held a view of human life that was different from that of the Western Allies. The value of the individual was secondary to the needs of the collective, and the state was willing to accept casualty rates that would have caused a political crisis in Britain or the United States. However, to say that this was the Red Army's only tactic is completely wrong. It ignores the evolution of the Soviet military into a sophisticated and powerful fighting force. The doctrine that guided this evolution was called deep battle. It had been developed in the 1930s by brilliant theorists like Mikhail Tukhachevsky before they were executed in Stalin's purges. The theory was shelved, but the ideas survived. As the war went on, and a new generation of commanders gained experience, deep battle was revived and put into practice. The concept was not to simply push the enemy back. It was to smash through the enemy's frontline defenses at a specific point, and then send massive armored formations tank armies deep into the enemy's rear. These formations would not stop to fight. Their goal was to bypass strong points and drive as deep and as fast as possible, destroying supply depots, headquarters, and communication lines. This would paralyze the enemy's command and control and cause the front line to collapse. This is exactly what happened in operations like Bagration in 1944 and the Vistula-Oder offensive in 1945. These were not human wave attacks. They were highly complex, combined arms operations involving meticulously planned artillery barrages, air support, and the coordinated movement of millions of men and thousands of tanks. The work of scholars like David Glantz has been essential in showing this reality. By studying Soviet-era archives, he has demonstrated that the Red Army of 1944-45 was, in many ways, the most effective ground army in the world. It was still willing to take heavy losses to achieve its objectives, but these losses were often incurred in the service of a sophisticated operational plan, not a mindless frontal assault. The human wave myth is an injustice to the skill and strategy that the Red Army eventually developed. How much of the human wave narrative was deliberately created by German generals in their post-war memoirs to explain away their own defeats? What percentage of Soviet attacks during the war could be fairly characterized as human wave tactics versus more sophisticated operational plans? Did the average Soviet soldier believe he was just being used as cannon fodder, or did he have faith in his commander's plans? And how did the Red Army's tactical and operational doctrines continue to evolve even in the final victorious year of the war? Number 3, how do you move an entire country's industry east of the mountains? In the autumn of 1941, it looked like the Soviet Union was finished. The German army was advancing on all fronts. They were approaching Moscow, Leningrad was surrounded, and they had overrun the country's most important industrial and economic regions. Most of the Soviet Union's factories, the ones that built the tanks, planes, and guns, were in the path of the invasion. The Soviet leadership made a decision of almost unimaginable scale and audacity. They decided to move their industry. Not just a few key factories, entire industries. They were going to dismantle them, put them on trains, and ship them 1,000 miles to the east, to the Ural Mountains and beyond, where they would be safe. It was one of the greatest logistical feats in history. It was a planned and brutal migration of people and machines. The State Defense Committee created an evacuation council to oversee the process. As the German army approached the city, teams of workers would swarm the factories. They worked around the clock, often under air attack. They unbolted the giant machines, the lathes, the presses, the furnaces from the factory floors. They loaded them onto flatbed rail cars. Nothing was left behind. They took the machines, the raw materials, the skilled workers, and their families. Between July and November 1941, over 1,500 large industrial enterprises were moved. It was chaos. The rail network was overwhelmed. Trains carrying factory equipment were mixed in with trains carrying troops to the front and trains carrying refugees fleeing the other way. The journeys took weeks. People lived in the unheated boxcars, enduring hunger and freezing temperatures. When they arrived in places like Sverdlovsk or Chelyabinsk, they found nothing. Often just an empty field covered in snow. There were no buildings. The workers, many of them women and teenagers, had to build the new factories from the ground up in the middle of a Siberian winter. They lived in hastily constructed huts or holes in the ground. They worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, on starvation rations. And as soon as a roof was put over a machine, it was turned on and started producing. The story of the Magnitogorsk Iron and Steel Works, as told by historian Stephen Kotkin, is a prime example. This pre-war industrial giant became the heart of the new war economy. Miraculously, it worked. By the middle of 1942, these transplanted factories were not only running, but they were outproducing German industry in key areas like tanks and artillery. It was this industrial base, safe behind the Urals, that provided the Red Army with the tools it needed to stop the Germans and eventually push them all the way back to Berlin. The human cost was immense, but without this desperate, brutal, and heroic evacuation, the Soviet Union would almost certainly have been defeated. How many people died during the process of the industrial evacuation, either on the trains or in the first brutal winter in the East? Were there any instances of industrial sabotage by workers who did not want to be relocated? We know about the big factories, but how did the Soviets manage to move the thousands of smaller workshops and subcontractors that were part of the industrial chain? And what was the long-term economic and demographic impact on the Ural and Siberian regions of this sudden, forced industrial revolution? Number 2, could the Soviet Union have survived without American trucks? When people talk about American Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union, they usually think of tanks and fighter planes. The US did send thousands of them, and they were important, but they were not the most important thing. The most critical contribution of Lend-Lease was not a weapon, it was the truck. Before the war, the Soviet Union was a country with a very poor road network and a severe shortage of motor vehicles. The Red Army was largely horse-drawn. This limited its operational mobility. It could fight a defensive war, but it struggled to mount the kind of large-scale, fast-moving offensives needed to win. Lend-Lease changed that. The United States sent over 400,000 trucks and jeeps to the Soviet Union. The most famous was the Studebaker US-6, a rugged, reliable 2.5-ton truck that could handle the terrible Russian roads. The Soviets loved them. They became the backbone of the Red Army's logistics. These trucks gave the Red Army something it had never had before: mobility. Suddenly they could move supplies, ammunition, and troops quickly and reliably. They could support the massive tank armies as they broke through enemy lines and drove deep into the rear. The Katyusha rocket launchers, one of the most iconic Soviet weapons, were often mounted on the back of American-made Studebaker trucks. Georgy Zhukov, the most famous Soviet commander of the war, stated after the war that without American trucks, the Red Army would not have been able to conduct its large-scale offensive operations. Even Stalin himself, in a conversation with Allied leaders, admitted that the war would have been lost without American production. Beyond trucks, the aid included millions of tons of food, as we've discussed. It also included entire factories, locomotives, and railway cars to rebuild the shattered Soviet rail system, and millions of miles of telephone wire to create a modern military communications network. The list goes on: boots for the soldiers, aluminum for building planes, high-octane aviation fuel that the Soviets couldn't produce in sufficient quantity. This is not to say that the United States won, the war for the Soviets. The Soviet people did the fighting and the dying. They stopped the German army at Moscow and Stalingrad before the bulk of Lend-Lease aid had even arrived. Their own industry produced the vast majority of their tanks and guns, but Lend-Lease was a critical enabler. It provided the margins of victory. It gave the Red Army the logistical capacity to transform itself from a slow, plodding force into a fast-moving, modern army that could conduct sweeping offensives across hundreds of miles. If Lend-Lease had been limited to just weapons and not logistical vehicles, could the Red Army have ever reached Berlin? How much did the reliability of American trucks, compared to their Soviet-made counterparts, contribute to the success of major operations? Did the presence of so much American equipment and food create any political friction or resentment among a population that was told they were achieving victory on their own? And what happened to all those hundreds of thousands of trucks after the war was over? Number 1, what if the war started in 1939 for the Soviets, not 1941? The official Soviet start date for the war is June 22nd, 1941. That was the day the German Reich invaded. It is remembered as a treacherous, unprovoked surprise attack, but this story leaves out a very inconvenient and uncomfortable fact. For the first 22 months of the Second World War in Europe, the Soviet Union was not a victim of the German Reich. It was its active partner. On August 23, 1939, just a week before the war began, the Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop signed a non-aggression pact in Moscow. The world was shocked. The two bitter ideological enemies had suddenly become allies. But the most important part of the treaty was not public. It was a secret protocol. In this protocol, the two dictatorships agreed to carve up Eastern Europe between them. Old Germany was given a free hand to invade the western part of Poland. The Soviet Union was given the eastern part of Poland, along with Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and a piece of Romania. On September 1st, 1939, the German army invaded Poland from the west. 2 weeks later, on September 17th, the Red Army invaded Poland from the east. The Polish state was destroyed, its territory divided between the two aggressors. This was not the act of a neutral country, it was the act of a co-belligerent. For the next 2 years, the Soviet Union was a vital economic partner to the German war machine. As detailed by historians like Edward E. Erickson in his book Feeding the German Eagle, the Soviets supplied huge quantities of grain, oil, and other raw materials to Germany, which was under a naval blockade by the British. This oil fueled the tanks that rolled into France in 1940. Stalin believed he had outsmarted everyone. He thought the pact would keep the Soviet Union out of the war, allowing the capitalist powers to exhaust each other, after which he could emerge as the dominant power in Europe. He ignored repeated warnings from his own spies and from foreign leaders, like Winston Churchill, that a German attack was imminent. He believed right up until the morning of June 22nd, 1941, that the pact would hold. This period is often called the Great Patriotic War in Russia, a name that deliberately frames the conflict as starting in 1941. It erases the memory of the pact, the invasion of Poland, the Winter War against Finland, and the annexation of the Baltic states. It transforms a complex and morally compromised story into a simple tale of heroic defense against a surprise attack. But the war did not begin for the Soviet Union in 1941. It began in 1939, when it chose to become an accomplice to the initial aggression, a decision that would ultimately lead to the deaths of tens of millions of its own people. What if Stalin had rejected the pact in 1939 and instead formed an alliance with Britain and France? Could their combined power have deterred the German invasion of Poland and prevented the wider war? How did the average Soviet citizen, who had been told for years that the regime in Berlin was their mortal enemy, react to the news of the pact? We know Stalin was surprised by the invasion, but did key members of his inner circle, like Molotov or Beria, secretly believe an attack was inevitable? And how does the difficult history of 1939 to 1941 continue to shape the politics and national identity of Russia and its Eastern European neighbors today?